I am joined by Rose Norman. She is the author of A Definitive History of the Pagoda, a lesbian community by the sea. It is an old-fashioned beach resort and was, at the time, a radically progressive agenda. Rose, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Glad to be here.
In just a moment, we're going to be joined by a former resident of the Pagoda, Cindy Watson. But start us off, if you will. Tell us in the simplest terms, what was the Pagoda?
The Pagoda was an old motel on the beach in Volano Beach in St. Augustine, and some women turned it into a lesbian cultural center and residential community that lasted 22 years.
This is Volano Beach. People who aren't familiar with that terrain, it's kind of north of St. Augustine, the next beach community up.
Next beach over from St. Augustine Beach, and you keep going down A1A and you get to Ponte Vedra, and then you get to Jacksonville.
Right. And so this was a departure, I would say, for what was the world of St. Augustine and probably all of Florida at that time, and for the United States. Pretty unusual for a community like this to come into being. How did it come?
Well, yes and no. The 70s were a time of great progress for the women's movement, and these were all feminists who had their consciousness raised during the women's movement of the early 70s. This was 1977 that they found the cottages and started buying them and turning them into the cultural center and community. But there were also many women's communities being formed in the 1970s. We did some research on women's communities in the South and counted 51 different ones.
Oh, wow.
In southern states, and 12 of them in Florida.
And so the idea behind the Pagoda was that it would be women only, that it would be lesbian only.
Well, the residential community was lesbian only. The cultural center was women only.
Okay.
The property was a sanctuary, really, for all women from the oppressions of patriarchy and the everyday things that they were trying to get righted in the world.
This was a small community. It was less than 2 acres at its largest. About how many cottages, in addition to the cultural center, made up that little area?
There are 12 cottages, and there were 3 strips. The property was in strips that were perpendicular to the beach. So unlike many motels, which are usually built along the beach, these were built perpendicular to the beach, facing each other. And then there was also a duplex. Shorty Reese was a real character in St. Augustine in the 1930s, and he built them all himself, one at a time. And he lived in the big house, the 2-story house that became the cultural center.
So it started in 1977. There were women that still remain there, but the Pagoda itself as an identified lesbian residential community, that came to an end in about 2016. Is that right?
I would say in '99, when the
cultural center
and swimming pool were sold, although they were bought by a lesbian group who had a different vision for the space. But the cottage associations is part of what made it a community, sort of like any kind of neighborhood association, and those cottage associations sort of ended around that time.
So, Rose, you taught English at the University of Alabama for nearly 3 decades. This is an incredibly researched book, as I mentioned. It's almost 400 pages long. The index itself is 23 pages long. It's just chock full of history. What made you want to write this book in the first place?
Well, the book came out of a much larger project to collect stories of lesbian feminist activism in the South that I've been working on with many others for about 15 years. And I was at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, which is extreme North Alabama. And near me is another women's residential community that was founded by members of the Pagoda. It was founded in 1997. I went over there to interview them about the Pagoda because I wanted to write a story that we were doing a little book about women's communities in the South. And I was just bowled over when they told me the story. There were 6 of them living there at Alapine is the name of that community. And their stories were just so wonderful that I started interviewing more people, and it was going to be a longer and longer story. And finally I thought, okay, it's going to be a book. And then I found they had tons of archival material that were saved for all those years, and we're sitting around in ungood places for
How long did it take you to research this?
10 years, I guess. 2013 was the first year, I guess. So I guess it was 10 years. And they didn't find those boxes. At first, I thought there wasn't much that had been saved. And then it started, well, there was one woman who had 10 photo albums of pictures that she had taken at the pagoda. So over 500 pictures and videos.
Wow. And so going through that, all of these interviews, I mean, it's interesting. I've worked in this market for a long time. I actually tried to do a story on the pagoda myself years ago
Really?
when I was working at the paper. And there was no interest. I mean, I spoke to a couple of the women there, and they were sort of, we don't really want a great deal of attention. We don't necessarily invite that, and we just as soon continue living our lives peaceably and not draw that. And that was in probably the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is the sense of, you know, at the time it felt like there was maybe just they didn't want to put themselves in the crosshairs.
That's exactly right. And that's true of most women's communities today. There's one in South Florida that won't even talk to a reporter. And some friends of mine who live in Tennessee were interviewed by, I believe it was a New York Times reporter, with one understanding, and then a big story comes out that misrepresented them. So the water has been poisoned for especially lesbian and gay communities, but women's communities generally.
I believe now that we are joined by Cindy Watson. She is best known in our community here as the founder of JASMYN, which is a resource for gay and lesbian and transgender youth. She retired recently, but so she's in retirement. But Cindy Watson, welcome. You were a resident of the Pagoda with your wife. Is that right?
Good morning, Anne and Rose. Yes, Garnet and I came to Florida in 1991, and we say landed at the Pagoda. Garnet had been a friend of the Pagoda, had been there several times, especially in the 80s when she was dealing with some political repression, and found that a real safe space. And so when we left Vermont to come to Florida, we stayed at the Pagoda for several months and fully engaged in the community. It was a wonderful experience.
And you talk about, or I believe you just kind of mentioned to me, but that you were coming to the South, you'd been in Vermont, and that reentry to the South was very difficult, particularly for lesbian women, and that this was kind of a transitional space for you?
Yes, the culture, it just wasn't safe. And there's lots of kind of targeting and a lot of bias and, some fears around just being open and out. And so the Pagoda community was a community, a real intentional community of women who defined themselves outside the influence and presence of men. And it was really radical and refreshing. It had a strong impact on me. The culture, I think of it as a cultural center. So the art, the music, the celebrations, the ways that women lived together in community, the meetings, all of that was very feminist and very woman-centered, and just a really refreshing kind of experience and some place for us to transition into, a conservative Southern community.
And that experience in some way prompted you to create JASMYN when you moved to Jacksonville. Is that right?
Well, it certainly had an impact on me. But, there was a small group of people already starting support groups for youth. And when they reached out to me, I saw that as a great opportunity to support young people with safe space. And, there's a real parallel. Pagoda was a safe space. It was a place where women for years went for healing and to be who they were. Women from all over the world, actually, would come to the Pagoda. And so when we were starting JASMYN, we really wanted that sense of safe space, a place for young people who were LGBTQ, queer young people to come in and be in a community and find their own voice and experience who they were, but also in a safety surrounded by peers. And so, yeah, I took a lot of, that experience and built on it in terms of helping JASMYN to get going.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the Pagoda. It is a history of a lesbian separatist community in Volcano Beach that was there for more than 2 decades. We're talking to the author, Rose Norman. We're also talking to a former resident, Cindy Watson. Rose, is Cindy's story the kind of thing that you heard when you were interviewing residents in terms of the impact of this experience?
Yes, especially the part about the healing space, many and the safe space. Many women came there and felt immediately just a breath, they could breathe again. That it was it, and it even though it was so small, and it was surrounded later. It wasn't originally surrounded by development, but um, the owners of the original owners of the motel were still living there for the first 10 years nearby, and yet they experienced its healing space. And part of that was because it was a spiritual community and an artistic community, as well as residential community. They had all these people coming in from all over the world, as Cindy said. And some of them, some of the residents were, one of the owners is from Canada, and she doesn't live there anymore, but she still owns it. And there was a woman from Germany who lived there for about 5 years.
It was an international destination, as you note in your book, and very much seen as a really, incredible and brave undertaking. But there were also challenges of having a community that was, comprised of people who some wanted a beach vacation, others were very much driven by a political agenda, and any community, of course, is going to have its tensions. I thought there was a really hilarious line from one former resident, I think it was Nancy Breeze, who called living there kind of like having a low grade fever the whole time.
Yeah.
So, talk about some of those challenges.
Well, one of the residents talked about it. She said it was like there were two pagodas. There was the one before it got all political, and then one that was founded by a dance theater troupe. The people who bought the first 4 cottages and rented the big house that became the cultural center had a dance theater troupe that was doing choreographed feminist dance all over Florida, and they wanted, one of them was a theater major, an actor who wanted to do feminist theater, and they did. They did. Had a playwright in residence there for 4 years who was writing original plays, and they were performing them. I think there were about 6 to 9 plays that were performed in the first 3 years. It later became more well known for women's music concerts. But theater was important. It drew artists the way St. Augustine draws artists.
Mm-hmm.
So St. Augustine, in that respect, was a good place for it, despite how conservative the area is generally.
And the place, I mean, it had a cultural center, so it had all these performances. It also had a natural food store. There was a pool. There was a craft store for a while. So it wasn't just a community of homes. There was all kinds of resources there for women and places for women to stay if they didn't even have a lot of money. I mean, it was a $20 a night for a rental, but you could kind of couch surf there a little bit if you needed.
You could. That was part of the way things were in the 70s and the 80s among the lesbian network. Although it was women only, not lesbian only, the cultural center. But yeah, they were very committed to making it affordable, to making the cottages affordable, not only for rent, but to buy. They had an agreement in the Cottage Association that if you wanted to sell, you would have to sell it for what you had in it, plus some percentage that was based on the consumer price index. And that was the idea, that when you bought a Pagoda cottage, you weren't buying it as an investment in a financial investment, the way most people buy property, but you were buying it as an investment in women's community.
So interesting. Cindy Watson, we talked a little bit about the complexities of a community like this, and some of the challenges. And one of the rules of this community, which was interesting and sometimes controversial, was, the fact that it was a women-only community, a lesbian-only residential community, meant that there was a prohibition on men, and that included children of women who lived there. Talk about your experience with that and what the challenge was there for you and your partner.
Well, for many years we were we were a part of that community. We were at all the events. Women could bring their daughters to special events. We had big birthday parties for the Pagoda and potlucks at Thanksgiving, and different kinds of things that were open to women and their daughters, but not their sons. And so if women had sons, then that meant they had to figure something else out. My wife and I adopted our sons a little bit later, but our first son came to us in 1998, and that meant that we couldn't bring him to the Pagoda, and so that necessitated a change in our relationship. We just couldn't spend the kinds of weekend time and evening time because we had the obligation of a child, so that kind of changed things for us.
And what was your feeling about that stricture? I mean, did you believe that was the way that the community should be operated? Did you challenge that idea once you had your sons?
I don't think we challenged it because we had been a part of that community and loved that women-only space and really understood. When you're in a group that is marginalized, experiencing oppression like the LGBTQ community, having safe space is so critical, and that separatist space was just so important to women, and we understood that and lived with that. And so, that was part of our decision when we decided to take in our first child, who was a son. We realized that was part of the decision we were making, and it was 1998. So, things were starting to wind down in the community and change again. So,
right.
We were okay. We didn't challenge it. We were okay. We understood it.
Gotcha. We have a call from Craig in St. Augustine. Good morning, Craig. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Well, thank you.
Good. I used to live at the Pagoda. I'm a male, and I lived in the St. Augustine area since '58. And the hotels, or as you refer to it, they were cottages actually, were built by the Schilling, or owned by the Schilling family for years and years, and they rented to surfers and beachgoers, and as things went on for year after year, I lived there for several years, probably 6 or 7, on the north row by the pool. And then the group of women started buying the other 2 rows and moved in, and me and my male roommate, we were not, we were just friends. We always had, the funniest part about it is we always had these women jumping over the fence to swim with us in the pool, and it was pretty funny. We would laugh at the fact that they were doing that, and as well as trying to adhere to what they were doing as a group. And but back then it was like I said, in the 70s or whatever that time was when it was. I can't remember. It's quite a while ago. But I just wanted to make that comment that it was kind of a mixture of people for quite a while prior to that, and it wasn't just the lesbian community. There was
Craig,
surfers and beachgoers and rentals. Yes, ma'am.
Craig, thank you so much for sharing your memory. I appreciate it. He's talking obviously about kind of the predates a little bit, the history of your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were male tenants when they first bought the cottages. Cottages had tenants, and the Schillings were a really interesting couple. They were Jane Schilling was a realtor and a pilot, and had a very interesting background. And her husband, Frederick, known as Pappy Schilling, was a radio host on what's it called? Fountain of Youth, WFOY, and he had just retired when they bought the Pagoda Motel from Shorty Reese, the one man who built all of them. And I even interviewed her grandson. She was married before, and she had a number of her children and grandchildren living at the Pagoda when they were running it. It sounded like it was less a motel than a place where college students would rent and get a laundry service from the from the Pagoda.
Sure, and Volano Beach back then, very freewheeling, kind of hippie.
The hippie beach.
Yeah,
Mhm.
very much so. Well, Rose Norman,
And-
oh, yes, go ahead, Cindy.
And yeah, when I was there in the 90s, there were no men living there at all. And actually, if sometimes men had to come onto the property, you know, for the pest control service, or once we needed roofing done, and so if men were going to be on the property, there were notices posted Tuesday afternoon, 2 to 4, men on the property, you know, and they always had to be escorted. So it was very intentional, you know, to keep it women only and to feel very safe.
It's a fascinating story. Rose Norman, thanks so much for coming in to share about it today. Cindy Watson, thank you so much for joining us on the phone with your memories of the Pagoda.
Thanks.